Hey everybody, happy Monday. I'm going to apologize up front that I am starting to lose my voice. I guess it was my turn to get sick, Stephanie, because I felt like shit this entire weekend.
I can't believe your symptoms are like identical to mine. Like it's crossed the ocean into Europe.
Yeah, that's why we'll see on Wednesday. Maybe it'll just be Stephanie talking the whole episode and I'll just wave.
Yep, there you
But
go.
today we want to talk about something a little different, but still totally relevant to everything that's going on right now. So, one of the biggest names in the Democrat elite donor circle we know is Soros, right? And it's not just the well known far left billionaire Hungarian George Soros, who we've talked about extensively on past episodes, where we've taken deep dives into the World Economic Forum. But there's also his equally insane, probably more so actually, far left son, Alex. And it's very clear that the Soros family is part of the global elite effort that's been funding the Biden Harris admin's efforts to censor free speech in America, and a lot of shit came up last week that we're going to talk about today related to stuff going on behind the scenes. So, there were some newly released grant records showing that the Soros backed Foundation to Promote Open Society sent $250,000 last year to Disinformation Index. And this was part of the effort to defund news outlets in the United States by blacklisting conservative media from receiving advertising dollars. Now, our State Department is also complicit in this censorship effort because the same funding records show that the State Department's Global Engagement Center used American taxpayer dollars to fund collaboration with Disinformation Index and fact checking entities to engage in censorship against small businesses in the United States. And this was all revealed a couple weeks ago in a new congressional report that was released by the House Small Business Committee. But back to Soros. So, according to the report, Soros also funded $100,000 in 2023 to the Atlantic Council to help fight alleged disinformation through one of the open society organizations. I don't know if there's just like multiple extensions of this organization, because this one is called Open Society Institute. And then there's the Alliance for Open Society International, another Soros backed organization that gave $100,000 to the Institute for Strategic Dialogue to support research on countering disinformation in Germany.
Okay, this is starting to sound like a money laundering scheme when you have open society in like three different, wordings of it. Like they're moving
Yes.
money around.
Exactly. Then Open Society gave 500,000 last year to Media Matters Action Network to combat disinformation. Soros funded 8 million last year to Global Witness, which is a left-wing British group that was pressuring social media companies to fight disinformation and misinformation online. And Congressional Rep Andrew Clyde from Georgia, he told the Washington Examiner last week, he said, quote, "From funding pro-criminal prosecutors to backing anti-free speech organizations, George Soros has a long track record of attempting to shred the fabric of our republic. Any steps taken to support groups censoring the American people in the name of combating disinformation is unacceptable and frankly un-American. Congress has a responsibility to investigate the funds, including taxpayer dollars, bankrolling efforts to unjustly silence conservative views, voices, and media organizations," end quote. And so the biggest part here is that the attempted censorship of conservative media and media in general, it's happening in another arena as well. So we need to take a look at something that's been escalating over the past couple of weeks that's really not being talked about much in the MSM. And that's the fact that George Soros is in the process of purchasing 200 radio stations in 40 markets in the United States. And most of these are conservative radio stations, including stations that host Glenn Beck, Mark Levin, Sean Hannity, Eric Erickson. And like, why is this a big deal? Well, there's several reasons. First, we have to go back to the beginning of the year in January, when a media company called Odyssey, which owns over 200 radio stations nationwide, they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy because they were in a shit ton of debt. Well, 6 weeks later, Soros Fund Management steps in and they buy up 40% of the debt to the tune of $414 million, which then made Soros Fund Management Odyssey's primary shareholder. The U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of Texas then approved a new reorganization plan for the company that allowed for equitization of over 80% of their debt. So then Odyssey asked the FCC to approve the transfer of its broadcast licenses to this, reorganized company. Well, the problem with this is it's fucking illegal and it's against FCC regulations. Section 310B4 of the Communications Act prohibits foreign owners from having a stake in a radio station license exceeding 25%. And George Soros, a foreigner, is now on his way to owning 40% of this company. So he's been pressuring the FCC to waive the foreign ownership restriction and expedite the purchase moving forward. And on top of that, they've asked the FCC to put off a national security review of foreign interest holders involved in the purchase of the radio stations. So basically, Odyssey and George Soros are pushing not to have foreign companies vetted. And like, who are these foreign interest holders? We have no fucking idea.
Yeah. Red flag. Why do they not want them vetted? Maybe it's because something not so great's going to turn up. And you know what? I think when it comes to broadcasting to the American public, I don't think there should be any foreign investment. Like, I think it should be solely American companies, because you're controlling the communication. Now, hats off to you, Tara, because I had heard nothing about this. I feel like usually, when I'm on social media, I'll see stuff long before it hits the news. I saw hardly anything. Like when you brought up this topic, I found like one Fox News article, which I usually don't use those. But it really, I was shocked that more people aren't screaming this from the rooftops. I did find something from a New York Post reporter, Lydia Moynihan, and she said, quote, the FCC decision to fast track his deal is the first time in modern history that such a deal has been approved by the full commission without first running the national security review process, a process that could take up to a year or more. Like, this is mind blowing. I mean, especially with such a politically charged figure like George Soros, it
Mhm.
absolutely blows my mind. And I think it's hilarious how, Kamala was running on, I'm going to tax the rich, but it seems like every day a new billionaire comes out in support of her. So
Yeah,
weird.
just a little bit. But honestly, the only reason I really knew about it was from listening to Glenn Beck. And then once I heard he did an interview with Brendan Carr, he's the FCC commissioner. And I listened to that interview and then I started looking up stuff. And that's how I had to dig to find articles because it's not in the MSM. And it's like the pressure that Soros is putting on the FCC, like it totally worked because they're moving forward with approving this deal, which, as you just pointed out, it's something they've never done before. And so the question is, why are they doing it now, right? Well, let's look at who makes decisions at the FCC. Well, it's a 5-member commission and it's made up of 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. So the majority rule is Democrats. And last Wednesday, they voted 3-2 to approve Odyssey's reorganization plan, obviously with the 3 Democrats voting for it, 2 Republicans voting against it. And according to Brendan Carr, again, the FCC commissioner, he's one of the 2 Republican committee members. And he said that this was, quote, an unprecedented decision for the commission, end quote. And it was a shortcut move that made for the very first time ever, it was made for the benefit of this Soros-backed group. So I want to play a clip from Glenn Beck interviewing Carr about the decision and why it matters.
Tell me, is Do I have this right, first of all, about the George Soros takeover of radio stations? And if so, why was there an exception made and fast tracked?
Well, as you note, the New York Post has a story out last week, or actually yesterday, that says that the FCC last week adopted an order that effectively fast-tracked Soros's purchase of these 200 radio stations. And I haven't commented on that publicly, because the fact is the FCC hasn't released a final decision to the public yet, but the reporting is that we adopted it last week in a 3-2 vote. I've been outspoken on this particular issue for the reasons that you talked about. We have a very clear process at the FCC that we've set up that could take 6 months, could take a year to go through to review the foreign ownership at issue here. But for reasons that are not sort of plain to me, the FCC Commission, for the very first time ever, has skipped that process for the benefit of this Soros-backed group. And I'll sort of let people draw their own conclusions about it. But again, it's an unprecedented decision for the commission.
Never happened before.
That's right. We at the commission level adopted one way that you can buy radio stations if you have excessive foreign ownership, which they do. And that one process is this lengthy 6 to 1 year national security review. And it's been skipped here. Now, a lot of these stations are probably just, classic rock or news, but not all of them.
They don't have to be. They get
there's a number of stations that, there's a number of stations that you're on. For instance, at least 3 stations that you're on that are part of this deal. Same with Sean Hannity. Same with Dana Lash. Same with Mark Levin. So there's at least some of these that are, conservative news and talk outlets.
I got to tell you, if this was a conservative doing this, I doubt the FCC would have okayed it. Any ramifications? Go ahead.
Yeah, Glenn, we actually have that example. So not too long ago, maybe a year or so ago, there was a group of conservative buyers that wanted to purchase some South Florida radio stations. And a number of Democrats spoke up very loudly and said the FCC cannot allow these conservative outlets to buy these radio stations because, in the Democrats' view, it could cost them elections in South Florida. And amidst that pressure campaign, the conservative buyers abandoned the deal. And so we've seen across the board concerted efforts by Democrats to sort of weaponize the government to go against conservative speech. There were California Democrats in Congress that wrote letters to cable companies telling them to drop Fox News, Newsmax, and OAN because of the editorial decisions that their newsrooms were making. We had a Baltimore Democrat prosecutor call on the FCC to investigate a local TV station that was exposing her own corruption. And so this is sort of the reverse side of a pattern that we've been living under the last couple of years of weaponization of government power, in my view, frankly, against free speech.
Okay, exactly, right? And this brings up another question. Like, we talk about this all the time. The MSM is a dying breed, right? But we don't really pay that much attention to radio. And then I was reading an article in the Washington Examiner from last week that said 42% of Americans get their news from radio, which kind of surprised me. And that more than half of news radio listeners are in the 50 to 64 age demographic. And I guess for this demographic, radio is still a very powerful medium for communication. And then the other important part of this equation is the issue of party affiliation when it comes to radio listeners. And apparently 46% of Republicans get their news from conservative talk radio stations. And so George Soros buying up conservative radio stations that reach more than 165 million Americans, right before an election, pushing for this, that's a bit suspect, don't you think, Stephanie?
Yeah, well, when you first told me about this, that was the first thing I thought. Okay, they're going to try to get in before the election so they can influence people to vote for Kamala, maybe with radio ads or maybe by censoring, the conservative shows, canceling them, whatever. Or could it be that they realize that Trump is likely going to win, so they want to take control now while Democrats, are still have somewhat control, and that way they can kind of control the radio market before he gets elected, knowing that this deal would not go through, likely, if Trump was in office. But I am totally shocked that 165 million Americans listen to the radio. Like,
Yeah.
I was just thinking about this the other day because I was in the car with my daughter, and we were in my mom's car and she was playing the radio. And I'm like, I can't even remember the last time I listened to the radio, because we always have like Spotify or Amazon Music or podcasts. So that freaking shocked me. I was going to say no one under the age of 50 still listens to the radio, but clearly like they do. And like you said earlier, we already know that the elites own the legacy media, like the mainstream news. And you said earlier, like it's a dying medium. We know that. And they know that as well. And that's why we've seen Kamala's campaign pouring so much money into like TikTok influencers. But if more than half of radio listeners are over the age of 50, then my thought process is those are probably the same like boomer generation that's watching the mainstream legacy news. So is that going to make much of a difference when when it comes to voting, when they're the ones that are already consuming the fake news narrative, so like maybe it won't make as much of an impact. But here's where I found something that I cannot believe I did not notice sooner. I feel like I connected dots and I'm like, being a podcaster, how have I been so naive to this? The mainstream media isn't dying at all. They're just moving to another medium. And the amount of people getting their news directly from podcasts has doubled since 2013. Okay. And it is growing exponentially. Like, it is wild when you look at the numbers. And so then I was like, interesting. Let me look up the top podcast networks. So these are the networks that host shows like Tucker Carlson, Joe Rogan, like all the different, podcasts, right? So I looked them up, and most of them are mainstream news companies or radio stations like Sirius Radio, iHeartRadio, NPR, the New York Times. And so when you start calculating new money now from people like Soros, I guarantee that they're going to dominate the podcast space as well. I mean, it looks like they already are. They're in the top 10 of these podcast networks. So that's where all of a sudden it all made sense to me. Like, why Soros would buy all these radio stations that are in a ton of debt and filing bankruptcy. Well, because it's part of the plan. Like, they're seeing the impact that Trump has been having by joining live streams and doing podcast interviews nearly every day. In addition to his rallies, he's reaching millions of Americans daily. And so I feel like the Democrat machine is now trying to buy their way in. And this is where Republicans need to pay attention, because I guarantee that Soros is going to get in there, and the plan is going to be to build up a new media online with podcasts. And all these radio stations are probably going to be turn into like a big podcast network that he now controls. And like I said, Republicans are always behind when it comes to this stuff. Okay. Like, instead of complaining about TikTok, they should be using it. Instead of making appearances only on Fox News, they should be doing interviews on podcasts. And like, Trump gets it. And the people he's surrounding himself with, like Vivek and Tulsi Gabbard and RFK, they all get it. But if people like Soros take over these podcast networks, then you better believe they're going to start censoring that stuff and they're going to start pushing propaganda. So this had me worried. Like, it wasn't even on my radar before about them controlling the podcast space, but I guarantee that's where this deal is going.
Yeah, because you think radio, like, no big deal, right?
Right.
But it is because even all the podcasts that I listen to, they all started out as radio shows.
Yeah.
And then they just moved over to the podcast medium.
Yep.
So it's
Like
a very
Sirius and
Yeah.
iHeartRadio. And now they're like the biggest ones. I mean, the amount of money that they make with podcasts is insane. So
Yep.
now he's going to control that money.
Exactly. And so even the House Oversight Committee is expressing concern. So last Thursday, after Brendan Carr disclosed this information to Congress, the House Oversight Committee opened up, their typical, we're going to start an investigation. But they're investigating the FCC's decision to expedite this purchase. And they're alleging that this decision was made, excuse me, in an effort to interfere in the election and politicize a body that's supposed to remain independent. So Committee Chair James Comer and Rep. Nick Langworthy, they're requesting that the FCC Chair Jessica Rosenworcel, they're requesting her to provide documents and communications that have taken place between January 7th, which is when Odyssey declared bankruptcy, and now. And they're giving the FCC a deadline of October 3rd to basically clarify why the FCC made this decision, especially in light of the fact that Soros is the financier of organizations that are, quote, advocating for speech restriction and censorship of conservatives online, end quote. They're also warning that Soros has sought to consolidate control over the airwaves, citing examples that the Soros Fund Management is investing in podcast platforms and purchasing radio stations in major media markets, which has ramifications for what Americans hear and influences political dialogue in this country. Now, here's something I didn't know. 31% of all media consumption in the United States consists of audio, even more than television consumption, which is at 24%. So according to Comer and Langworthy, they said, quote, by all appearances, the FCC majority isn't just expediting, but is bypassing an established process to do a favor for George Soros and facilitate his influence over hundreds of radio stations before the November elections, end quote.
Yeah. I mean, this is outrageous. And this is also the guy who was the financier for the DAs that are going after Trump politically.
Yeah.
Like, it's just absolutely mind blowing that this is being allowed to happen. But here's the thing.
Wait, let me wait. How did I pronounce financier? What did I say?
I think you said it that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was like struggling with that word. Okay.
No, you said it right. But I feel like with the House especially, but even the Senate, the Republicans, it's like playing whack-a-mole. They're dealing with one thing and then another thing pops up. And then they got to like run over and fix this. And then they drop the ball with the other thing. And they're just constantly juggling all these different investigations. They're always on the defense. And so it's like, no wonder nothing gets done because they're too busy like dealing with all this shit that the left keeps throwing at them. And here's just another example of that. And it's just blowing my mind right now because every day we hear about how the media ratings are dropping and dropping and dropping. And you look at that compared to the ratings of podcasts going up and up and up. And I felt so good about that until now, because now I'm like, great. No, they're on top of it. They're just going to buy up all of these networks. But then for the longest time, it's like you look at Soros, this guy is old. And I'm like, how long is he going to be around to continue this reign of political control, right? Like it's got to end soon. Well, according to that Fox News article that I read, Soros handed control of his entire political empire last year to his son, Alex, that you mentioned earlier. And his various organizations have continued to exert significant financial influence, including, get this, Tara, millions of dollars that they poured into flipping Texas to Democrats. I'm like, really? Okay, they're going to go after Texas of all places. And I think we talked about this a while back, but his son, Alex Soros, is engaged to Huma Abedin, who is Anthony Weiner's ex-wife. And she was also the vice chair of Hillary Clinton's campaign. There's a lot of interesting information on this woman. If you go on TikTok and search her name up, you'll see all kinds of evil stuff. But last week, Alex posted on X and he said, quote, honored to host Governor Tim Walz at my home in New York City. And then a few weeks back, he apparently met with Kamala as well and posted, quote, great to recently catch up with Madam Vice President. And he's also cozy with like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. So this guy is following right in his father's footsteps and is going to continue this crazy leftist propaganda for years to come. So not good news there.
No, and I think he's actually scarier than George Soros because he's young. He's, connected with all of the social media stuff that probably, his dad didn't have the same amount of influence with. And so I think this is actually pretty scary. And I want to play this clip from an interview that Vivek did with Laura Ingraham on the Ingraham Angle on Fox last week.
You got Alex Soros meeting with Tim Walz. You have the global establishment, the World Economic Forum types, Oprah, Taylor Swift. These are the billionaires. Not that Trump doesn't have a few billionaires, but most of the billionaires are for Kamala Harris. What do they want to preserve, Vivek, so the viewers out there tonight fully understand what's at stake?
So look, I have no objection to being a billionaire, speaking as somebody who has lived the American dream myself. But what I do have an objection to is the kind of puppeteering that you see now in the Democratic Party. Look at those images of Alex Soros standing next to Tim Walz. Looks like if you squint really closely, you can even see the puppet master pulling the strings right there. And that, I think, is the ultimate irony. The party that will tell the poor in this country that the rich people are screwing you over are indeed the very rich people who are speaking that message to people and deceiving them. What's at stake here? It's the status quo, where effectively the people in power blow the woke smoke. They'll tell you, give you your victimhood narratives for yourself, so they're able to preserve greater power for their own interests. Nowhere do we see this more pronounced than in our foreign policy. I think this war in Ukraine does not best serve American interests, and Donald Trump is right to want to bring peace to that conflict. Yet you do see a global establishment almost goading on the furtherance of that war in a way that doesn't advance American interests.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he brought up the war, but it's the globalist idea, right? And like, that's exactly what the Soros family is all about, is this global political control. And even Tim Walz supporters were pointing out that it was a bad idea for him to post that shit about meeting with Alex Soros last week and put it on social media. People were saying it was bad optics before the election, and like, meeting with a billionaire in a high-rise apartment, like a swanky apartment, probably isn't going to appeal to the middle-class voters that Kamala keeps trying to pretend she's a part of and in support of. You had an MSNBC columnist respond and say, quote, "Unclear how either party benefits from this." End quote. Then we have the co-founder of Vox, which is another total left-wing publication, who said, quote, "With respect, probably not helpful for you to put yourself in the story like this," end quote. But I was reading this article in the New York Post, and it basically it pointed out, why bother hiding it when their ideologies are exactly the same, right? They both, the Soros family and Kamala and Tim Walz and the Biden admin, they all have this same vision of destroying America and creating this one world global government. And the article kind of went through this comparison, and it was like, okay, we have the Soros family that spent over $40 million to put a bunch of corrupt district attorneys in office throughout the country. And then comparing that to, when Walz let Minneapolis burned to the ground in 2020. It was the Soros-backed prosecutors who refused to prosecute any of the rioters. We have the Soros family that's funded countless, pro-open border groups and NGOs that provide legal services to illegal migrants, which is pretty much what Tim Walz did when he signed legislation to give state-funded healthcare and driver's licenses and free college to all these illegal migrants. We have the Soros Open Society Foundation wanting to extend voting rights to felons and saying that it's racist if we don't. And then we have, Walz signed a law to grant the franchise to 55,000 felons. The article points out that, George Soros clearly infiltrated the Biden-Harris admin already. I guess there's 17 people who previously worked for Soros who are now in positions of power within our federal government, including in our State Department, the Department of Defense, and the Federal Reserve, as well as within Biden's cabinet. Like Antony Blinken is very well connected with the Soros family. So, should we expect any less from Alex Soros? No, he's supporting the exact same shit, but he's just doing it more flagrantly than his father. And I think Elon Musk put it perfectly after this, picture with Walz and Alex Soros came out, and he said, quote, "I just like to thank Alexander Soros for not keeping everyone in suspense about who the next puppet would be," end quote.
That is perfect. And it's such a good point. And I think, in 2020 and earlier, they could get away with stuff like this, but now people are awake to it, and everything, it contradicts everything that they say on the campaign trail. You have this ad of him, Tim Walz, like fixing a car, like he's trying to appeal to like middle class workers. But then he's in a swanky apartment with Alex Soros.
Yeah,
It's just
the retired school teacher, right?
right.
Yeah.
And then Kamala is constantly, every chance she gets, she makes a comment about Trump being a billionaire. But then everyone literally that's come out to support her in the last 2 weeks is a billionaire. Like it's just, it contradicts everything. So yeah, I don't think it's good optics for them. I think everyone's aware of Soros at this point, and just I feel like they blame him. Like his name comes up when you think about crime in the major cities, because we all know he funded the DAs that are letting criminals run wild and, get released without bail. So yeah, I mean, I think this will hurt them campaign wise, and maybe that's why I couldn't find a damn thing on it, because they're actively working to cover up this little mess that could be bad publicity for them.
Yep.
So at least you're on top of it, Tara. Good work. I wouldn't have seen that. So yeah, we'll stay on top of all this nonsense, but it sounds like this deal isn't done yet. Likely to go through, but I'll keep my fingers crossed that it doesn't. So we'll keep you posted on that and everything else coming up. I hope everyone has a great week, and we'll see you back.